Be quiet now, listen to the bugle! We're almost there.
Before the sun admits what it is, the highlands around Adwa hold their breath. Slate-colored ridges, thin air that bites the throat, a line of lanterns trembling like nervous stars, and somewhere between the last drumbeat and the first Italian bugle, a sheet of parchment waits to decide whether a kingdom will be a rumor or a warning. Adwa, the 1st of March 1896. On one side of that paper, the ink says friendship. On the other, obedience disguised as etiquette. 6 disputed words lie coiled in the margin like a trap, promising that a young European empire, marching out from its Red Sea foothold in Eritrea, will inherit the continent's pattern rifles, flags, surrender, because that is how the story has been ending in Africa. But the ridgelines here are older than any map, the faith older than any telegraph, and the mountain is uninterested in habits formed elsewhere. Listen closely. The bugle's note is confident, but the drum knows the ground. If you value stories like this, subscribe to support the channel so we can make the next one. By 1896, the Scramble for Africa had redrawn almost everything. Berlin's rulers divided a continent with rulers and ink, and nearly 90% of the map answered to someone overseas. Ethiopia did not. That was not an accident of distance. It was policy practiced at the tempo of survival. Menelik II understood that a crown without clocks is a costume. He bartered time with charm and patience, wrote to courts that doubted him, cut deals where leverage lived, and bought modern rifles the way a mason buys stone carefully. From whoever would sell, including powers that imagined those barrels would never be pointed back. But steel alone does not sing. In Addis Ababa, Empress Taytu Betul read loyalties the way others read accounts. She treated gossip as a wire, turned markets into levers, placed eyes and ears in places diplomats preferred to imagine empty, and kept quarrels among nobles on a leash tight enough to pull them toward a common horizon when the weather turned. Across the water, Italy, young, ambitious, embarrassed by its late entry into empire under General Oreste Baratieri, needed a victory that felt inevitable, needed Eritrea not as a dot on a map but as a springboard to prestige, needed the kind of result that could be paraded through parliament and the press. So, paper went to work. The Treaty of Wuchale in Italian offered both sides the fiction of harmony. Then Article 17 sharpened the fiction into a blade. In Amharic, the language of the emperor's court, the clause said, Ethiopia may use Italy's good offices in foreign dealings. An option, a courtesy, a door that could remain politely shut. In Italian, the same breath hardened into obligation. Ethiopia must. For lay ears, a protectorate is a relationship where another state hijacks your foreign policy and speaks for you abroad, while still letting you keep the costume jewelry of local rule. Menelik did not keep costumes. When the mismatch surfaced, he refused to pretend the chain was a ribbon, and Taytu's look across the council table made plain that the price of swallowing this word would be paid in coin the empire did not mint. Beneath the theology of treaties, lives, logistics, wells and grain, passes and pack animals, runners who make sense of rumors, quartermasters who can multiply a sack of flour across distance. Beneath the doctrine of modern battle lives terrain. Lines of sight that kill artillery, ravines that stretch a timetable until the plan's lungs burn. The truth hiding in those 6 words was not merely a translation error, it was the assumption that Africa could be edited from afar, that the oldest Christian kingdom on the continent would nod and sign, and be grateful for a leash woven in a European capital. Instead, the parchment on the table became tinder. Letters flew to foreign chancelleries announcing that sovereignty does not carry an asterisk. Caravans turned into arteries. Scouts learned the sound a column makes when it has more confidence than maps. Priests blessed steel without romanticism. The Red Sea breeze thickened with dispatches and pride. Despite the warning at Amba Alagi and the lesson of the siege at Menelik, Italy, sure that the ritual would repeat 3 columns. Pre-dawn movement, seize the heights, let guns and volleys speak, tightened its laces. Ethiopia, sure that the ritual could be broken, coalition in place. Powder stockpiled, water guarded, routes rehearsed, tightened its grip. In the blue hour before history composes itself into a headline, we are left with 2 instruments testing each other's pitch. A bugle calling across the ridge, a drum line answering from within the hills, and a treaty on a wooden table that pretends it can translate power. When words break, supply lines speak. Quiz. Which factor most ignited the crisis? A. The Italian Protectorate reading of Article 17. B. Menelik II's refusal to accept foreign control. Comment A or B below. Grain moves before glory, and in the months after the break with Article 17, the empire learned to count in miles and mouthfuls rather than speeches. Menelik II did not treat preparation as a ceremony. He treated it like weather you could shape if you read the sky correctly. From Addis Ababa, messengers unspooled along caravan routes like nerves, touching depots where sacks of teff were stacked under canvas, where mule shoes were checked and rechecked, where crates stenciled in foreign alphabets were opened with the care of priests lifting a reliquary. The rifles were a babel of steel Mauser bolts that slid with a clean click. Older conversions carefully kept alive, a handful of field guns whose crews learned to respect the mountain's temper. They had been bought from men who believed profit outruns politics, and from governments certain that distance would keep the irony quiet. But arms are only potential until logistics makes them inevitable. Ethiopia's advantage was not just courage, it was geometry. Interior lines short, protected, fed by villages that understood what was at stake, let supplies pulse like a heartbeat to the front. Across the ridges, Italy's lifeline stretched back to the Red Sea. Every bend and climb taxing the timetable, every dry well a small defeat that did not make the reports. If rifles and grain were arteries, intelligence was breath. Empress Taytu Betul made sure the empire inhaled truth and exhaled denial. She did not romanticize loyalty, she managed it. In market tents and monastery courtyards, in the camps of nobles who measured themselves against one another more often than against outsiders, her eyes and ears learned to separate the scorpion's sting from the cricket's noise. A well that could be contested was watched at dusk and dawn. A trader who might carry messages for coin was shadowed until coin felt heavier than conscience. A rumor crossed with a second rumor, then sent for verification by a scout who knew the difference between ridge dust and march dust. The network did not look like a web. It looked like a landscape that refused to lie. When Italian agents probed for softness, they met markets that would not sell at any price and roads that seemed to take longer coming back than going out. When emissaries whispered to ambitious men, Taytu's letters arrived first with promises and limits measured to the recipient's pride. The result was not a mirage of unity but a functioning coalition. Amhara and Tigray standing near one another without flinching, Oromo horsemen tying their reins in the same yard as Highland infantry, Orthodox priests and Muslim leaders speaking blessings over the same cooking fires, because thirst and invasion draw a tighter circle than debate. Training turned noise into music. On hard-packed clearings scoured of rock, sergeants paced the lines like metronomes, teaching fire discipline that could be heard rather than seen file by file, breath by breath, the difference between courage and waste embodied in the count between shots. Quartermasters in plain cloaks became minor sorcerers, taking a ledger's scratch marks and turning them into half rations, stretched an extra day, assigning a mule to a man who would reach the pass an hour sooner, swapping a worn sling for one that would not fail when the ground tilted and men needed both hands. Workshops in the capital learned the dialects of foreign screws and springs, and smiths who had mended plows found themselves coaxing stubborn breech blocks back to life. There was no illusion that the empire had become Europe. The land itself would be pressed into service. Scouts knew where a ravine was not a path, no matter how it looked on a flat map. Where a shadow at noon on a particular boulder meant there was water under gravel, 3 spear lengths to the right, where sound carried strangely so that a bugle heard here was actually a bugle there. They began to chart not only where the Italian columns were, but what the columns thought they were hearing. Meaning, too, was provisioned. When clergy lifted hands over barrels of powder, it was not to sanctify violence but to sanctify restraint, to remind men that the shot not taken until the right angles were ready was sometimes the holiest act. The word holy did not turn steel into myth. It turned fear into something with edges a man could hold without cutting himself. Camp by camp, oaths were taken in voices that carried just far enough for neighboring units to know this was not posturing. You could feel the coalition in the quiet moments, how men from villages that once glared at each other over pasture rights shared a water skin and then shared a silence that said the pasture would still be there if they did this right. And always the arithmetic returned. If the invader must carry water uphill and you can draw yours from a spring you protected last season, if his animals burn muscle to deliver his next meal and yours walk an easy circle between depot and line, If his messengers have to explain every delay to officers who think terrain is insolence, and you only have to nod to a commander who has slept on this ground before, then the battle begins before the first shot and ends long after the last headline. As men, grain, and steel converged around Adwa, the camp became a city of intention. At dusk, the slopes hummed with small labors, a strap mended, a prayer whispered, a map scratched into dirt and smoothed away with the heel. At dawn, the same hum returned with an extra thread of tension, a listening for a sound that would confirm the pattern they had been building toward. Messengers came in from the north with reports that felt like a solved riddle. Italy would march in 3 columns before first light, seeking to seize heights and fold the day to its doctrine. The cornerstones were set: logistics that could feed the weight, intelligence that could feel the ground through the soles of its feet, commanders who understood that sometimes the bravest order is to hold, and a coalition that believed it was defending not an abstraction, but the ordinary tenderness of life lived uninsulted. Somewhere beyond the last cooking fire, a runner paused to trace a ridge with his finger and measure the time it takes a signal to die in a crosswind. Then he ran. Preparation meets a marching problem. 3 columns, 1 mistake. Night erased the edges of the mountains, and the Italian plan mistook that mercy for advantage. Lanterns bobbed through the dark like a necklace sliding off a table as 3 columns left their camps in confidence, each convinced that paper could domesticate stone. General Albertone aimed his men toward Kidan Muret, Dabermida angled for the heights of Bila, and Aramondi held the center, the whole design counting on synchronized bites that would seize the crests before dawn and let rifles and artillery dictate the rest. Doctrine, on flat ground, loves triangles and clocks. But Adwa's night has a different geometry. On the first slope, a path that had looked true in daylight split into 2 goat tracks that braided and parted like arguments. Farther on, a ridgeline that seemed a spine from the general's table turned out to be a row of broken teeth. Every gap asked for a choice, and every choice stole seconds from the next. Runners slid on scree, rows cursed and bleeding, and delivered messages already past their usefulness. Bugles tried to stitch the dark together, but the valleys edited sound without permission, sending a call sideways so that a unit moved to support a ghost. Elevation, which on maps announces dominance, began to behave like isolation. Guns struggled for line of sight while companies slotted into dead ground, perfectly safe and perfectly useless, waiting for orders that could not find them in time. On another ridge crouched an Ethiopian scout with dust in the creases of his hands, counting the pauses in the column below, the way a shepherd counts spaces between thunder and lightning to guess how far the storm has wandered. He had walked this shoulder of the mountain in dry season and rain, knew the rock that rattled loose 2 steps before you stood on it, knew the shadow at midnight that meant the gully kept a trickle of water under its gravel. He did not need a compass to sense the turn the Italians had missed. Their march had acquired the ragged breath of men moving faster than their map. Across a fold in the land, an Eritrean askari pulled his scarf tighter and felt a quiet argument in his chest that had nothing to do with pay ledgers or parade ground pride. The cold was honest. It bit and left a mark. What he did not trust was the way the ridges seemed to move when the line of lanterns swung left and then left again to repair a mistake. He thought of the Red Sea's heat and of how different the wind felt when it had not just licked snow. And he kept stepping because a soldier's calculation is simple, until it isn't. Stay with the line, keep your place in the file, trust that artillery will find its voice with the light. In the dark above him, commanders under Menelik II were holding their own argument with patience. Fire discipline is not only for daylight, it is a way to turn restraint into a weapon. Their orders, shaped by the ground and by intelligence stitched together under Empress Taytu Betul's watch, were to let the columns drift out of time with themselves, to let the left hand lose track of the right, while the center ran out of breath trying to be both. Killing zones were not circles drawn in bloodlust. They were angles chosen by the mountain's own grammar crossfires that would feel like a sudden change in the weather rather than a trumpet blast. Scouts relayed the 2 facts that mattered most. The head of one column had mistaken a false summit for the height, and the tail of another had chosen a path that would make it late by minutes that matter more than hours. On the Italian side, an officer snapped his watch shut, unsure whether the fault lived in brass and springs or in the land itself. He sent a runner anyway, a man whose footsteps wrote a message across shale that the next gust would erase. The askari watched him go and, against instruction, counted to 100 to measure how far a man can carry urgency uphill at this altitude. The scout counted with him from a different ridge, without knowing the other man existed. In each count there lived a truth that the map had not confessed. The mountain keeps time for itself. As the air thinned and the sky paled, artillery crews wrestled their pieces into positions that would make sense on a parade field, and mean nothing once the light revealed how the folds of ground broke every promised line. The columns, each living in its own small world, believed the others were close enough to touch by plan alone. Distance. A patient saboteur said otherwise. A priest in the Ethiopian camp finished a blessing with a hand laid on a rifle stock, as if to cool fever, and a captain repeated the order to hold until the light could turn the trap from an idea into a place. Breath pooled in ravines, boot soles whispered on dust flavored with frost, and somewhere a last lantern felt foolish in the company of dawn. Then the sun broke, and the trap snapped shut. Sun came like a blade, cutting the mist into ribbons, and with that thin light the mountain revealed its loyalties, not to flags, but to those who understood how to listen. The first crack of rifles along the slopes above Kidan Meret did not sound like bravado. It sounded like discipline files taking turns, bolts worked by habit rather than hunger, elevation turning every controlled burst into pressure on General Albertone's column that textbooks had promised elevation would relieve. Men tried to dress their lines and found the ground undressing them, seams coming apart where gullies interrupted sight and stone pulled formations into crooked threads. To the right, on the heights of Bela, Debermida's assault found rock doing what no sandbag could do, swallowing silhouettes and spitting them back in new positions. Defenders using breastworks of the earth to make every approach feel longer than the clock allowed. In the center, Aramondi's confidence depended on flanks that were already laboring. Messages that might have mattered arrived just late enough to be elegant instead of useful. Artillery crews wrestled their pieces into angles that would have dominated a parade field, only to watch the land swallow their lines of sight. Shells arced with conviction and spoke mostly to sky. The Italian plan counted on synchronized pressure. Instead, each wing discovered that the other was either too far away or moving inside a different version of morning. Ethiopian commanders, reading the light as if it were a new dispatch every breath, bled patience into aggression at the exact moment the geometry agreed. From a ridge where the air felt like glass, Menelik II sat steady and visible enough to make calm contagious. Runners came and went with messages that were short, repeatable, and rarely reversed. Below the crest, Empress Taytu Betul worked with the same unsentimental clarity she had brought to networks and markets. Reserves held until distance widened, water sent where the slope would punish thirst fastest, ammunition mules pushed to units whose hands were steady enough to turn each cartridge into an argument the enemy would hear. The counterstroke did not look like a lunge. It looked like timing asserting itself. Cavalry did not chase glory into the teeth of the guns. They pinned men where the ground pinned them already, turning options into corners. Infantry did not waste breath on theatrics. They shifted by platoons, changing angles the way a locksmith tries teeth on a stubborn lock, then turning the captured key. Supply trains packed with food, the mountains had taxed mercilessly on the way up, became prizes with second lives, rifles and cartridges becoming Ethiopian mid-sentence without the sentence breaking. Somewhere in the crush, an Eritrean askari dropped his pack to run faster, then his rifle to run faster still, discovering the treachery of momentum on loose stone, while an Ethiopian runner, lungs raw and eyes dry, threaded through the same chaos with a note to hold fire on the next ridge until the center finished folding. The route announced itself not with a shout, but with a sound that veterans know the tone of men who have stopped looking sideways for orders and started looking behind them for ground that will not move. Officers tried to pour doctrine over the moment and discovered that doctrine, like water, follows the land it is given. Some units fought their way out in knots, others simply dissolved into direction. Captured field guns turned at angles their former crews had misjudged, breeches clacking with the blunt finality of a door closing. The mountain did not gloat. It watched as weight became the enemy of speed and maps became confetti in the wind. When the volume receded, the ledger began to write itself in a gentler hand than rumor allows. Prisoners were gathered and tallied, wounded, lifted, or led, treated where mercy had room. Dead counted without spectacle because grief travels farther when you do not dress it for the stage. By day's end, roughly 7,000 Italian and colonial troops were killed, about 1,500 wounded, and more than 3,000 taken prisoner, while Ethiopian losses, though significant, were markedly lighter. Flags were not planted in triumph so much as set in place to mark a change of weather. For the first time in a long parade of colonial encounters, the myth that had walked through Africa in pressed uniforms and predictable sentences stumbled on ground that refused to be a background. Menelik's choice to be seen when it mattered, and Taytu's insistence on feeding tempo rather than fever, made an army feel governed at the exact scale of the fight, not from a map's indifferent distance. By late day, the echoes that bounced between ridges no longer belonged to bugles but to a quieter thing. The realization, carried in whispers and then in headlines, that a European force had met an African plan on African terms and lost cleanly. Adwa did not end history. It corrected its grammar. Defeat is an ending. Adwa turned it into a beginning. By late afternoon, the mountains around Adwa sounded different, as if the wind had learned a new word and was trying it on the ridgelines. Banners were lowered to half height while the living did the algebra of mercy water for the wounded, shade for the fevered, a tally stick for the missing, because the work after victory is quieter and heavier than the shouting imagined by distance. Messengers rode out with letters that would travel farther than any bugle, accounts of prisoners gathered and treated, inventories of captured rifles and field pieces tagged for repair, names of officers fallen or spared, requests for grain and canvas and salt to make the next day livable. In Addis Ababa, the script changed from rumor to policy. Menelik II, who had spent years cultivating a choir of courtiers and consuls, now had a chorus whose music Europe could not ignore. Negotiators arrived with faces trained for composure and left with the memory of a reality that spoke more plainly than any communiqué. A modern European force had been beaten on African ground by an African plan, and the price of pretending otherwise had just become unaffordable. In the documents that followed, the loudest sentence was made of silence. The Italian pretension to a protectorate fell away, and with it the mask that Article 17 had worn. The clause that had tried to turn may into must lost its teeth. A treaty signed in the language of retreat acknowledged what the morning had proved in powder. Ethiopia would speak for itself to the world, and did not require an interpreter. Out on the roads, chains of custody turned into chains of learning. Captured rifles were not trophies so much as textbooks. Armorers opened their throats and taught Ethiopian hands. The grammar of foreign steel, how a particular spring sulks, how a breech prefers to be coaxed rather than commanded. Field guns that had betrayed their first masters by obeying the mountain's physics were measured and mated to crews who read the land first and the manual second. Workshops grew cleverer, ledgers grew stricter. The army that had arrived in faith and preparation left with something rarer than victory capacity. The material mattered, but the more important harvest was intangible. Regiments that had fought side by side now owned a memory together, and memory holds coalitions in place when speeches fray. Menelik kept his visibility when it was useful, and vanished when it was wiser to let governors govern. Empress Taytu Betul continued to stitch politics to provisions, her letters as exacting as a quartermaster's knot, her presence reminding rivals that the empire's strength was a discipline before it was a banner. Far beyond the escarpments, presses in European cities set larger type than usual, trying to get ahead of disbelief. Editors negotiated with words they had not needed before: decisive, Ethiopian, modern, victory. 4 nouns and adjectives that looked awkward until repetition taught them to sit together. Across the Atlantic, readers in Harlem and Boston clipped columns and read them aloud in kitchens and church basements because the story carried electricity along circuits that predated the telegraph. If sovereignty could be defended here, perhaps it could be imagined there. In Accra and Lagos, in Nairobi and Johannesburg, a palette long loved by an ancient kingdom, green, yellow, and red, learned to travel as an argument stitched into cloth. Pilgrims made new itineraries. Some went to Addis Ababa with curiosity and returned with a seriousness at odds with vacation. Some simply walked taller in markets that had once shrugged at their ambition. Ethiopia became less a place on a map than a sentence you could place in your mouth and feel your back straighten as you pronounced it. It is tempting to polish this into myth, to pretend there was no muddle, no exhaustion, no contradiction left in the bodies of the living or the policy of the state. But Adwa's endurance lies precisely in its refusal to be a clean portrait. It was coalition before it was chorus, logistics before it was legend, intelligence before it was inevitability, and meaning before it was memory. The leadership lessons are not carved into granite so much as written on tools still in use. A ruler who lets presence steady rather than intoxicate. A partner whose attention to water and grain and letters gives doctrine a spine. Commanders who know when a held shot is stronger than a loud one. Citizens who see that sovereignty is defended daily in rations and roads as much as in charges. The moral calculus did not end with the last volley. It began with the first repaired breach, the first oath kept long after the drum faded, the first choice to bind a rival today in order to face a greater win tomorrow. The clause we began with Article 17 was not simply a linguistic ambush. It was a worldview that assumed Africa could be defined across water. Its undoing was not only ballistic but conceptual. When Menelik II refused to let may be spoken as must, he didn't merely defend etiquette. He defended agency, the right of a state to be a subject in its own grammar. Empress Taytu Betul's patient counterpoint ensured that grammar had a vocabulary: food, roads, wells, oaths. Together they taught a lesson that travels better than any army. Clarity is a kind of power. Each March, in the highlands where the air still carries the memory of that morning, people gather and speak the name of Adwa as if it were both a map and a prayer. In present-day Addis Ababa, glass and steel climb where mule paths once braided, and yet the essential choreography remains the balance between speed and patience, between vision and provision, between the visible and the quiet. The wind says the same syllables it said that day, and if you listen, you can hear the shape of a promise inside them. That technology without humility will always underestimate terrain. That ambition without logistics will always misread distance, and that a people who know what they are defending will always read a mountain faster than any map. Adwa is not the end of a story or even the middle. It is a hinge that taught history how to swing both ways. If a mistranslated line could launch a war, imagine what clarity can build. Across 5 chapters, one figure stands at the center of a reversal that felt impossible for its time. Emperor Menelik II, flanked by Empress Taytu Betul, reading both the mood of an empire and the grammar of a continent. In a world where the scramble for Africa had colored 9/10 of the map in foreign ink, Ethiopia refused to be a footnote. Menelik's statecraft began with clocks and letters buying time through diplomacy, writing to courts that underestimated him, converting leverage into rifles and shells from any dealer who valued profit over prophecy. Taytu made that strategy breathe. She mapped loyalty like a quartermaster counts grain, turned wells and markets into forms of pressure, and built an intelligence web that could tell ridge dust from march dust. When the Treaty of Wuchale in Italian presented Article 17 with 2 faces, one a polite option and the other an iron leash, the imperial court answered with clarity rather than etiquette. Protectorate would not be the word that renamed Ethiopia. The months that followed were not the rush to glory that stories prefer. They were the patient arithmetic of logistics. Depots bloomed along interior lines. Mules, ledgers, and workshops learned the dialects of foreign steel. Training turned zeal into fire discipline. Italy, chasing prestige from a foothold in Eritrea, brought a familiar script. 3 columns, pre-dawn, seize the heights, let guns decide. Night and mountain took the pen away. The columns slipped out of time with one another. Runners wrote messages the wind erased. Elevation behaved like isolation. At sunrise, Ethiopian rifles spoke in measured bursts from angles chosen the day before. Artillery found the land had eaten its line of sight. Menelik's visibility steadied tempo. Taytu's control of water and ammunition kept patience from curdling into frenzy. The counterstroke looked less like a charge than a decision arriving on schedule. Cavalry pinned, infantry pivoted, supply trains changed owners. By afternoon, the myth that had marched across Africa in pressed uniforms had a new paragraph. A modern European force had lost cleanly to an African plan on African terms. After Adwa, policy replaced rumor. The must that Italian lawyers had tried to slip into Article 17 fell away. Ethiopia spoke for itself. Captured rifles became textbooks, workshops became institutions, and a coalition hardened into memory. Headlines in Europe learned new pairings: decisive, Ethiopian, victory, while the African diaspora found in Adwa not only a symbol but a syllabus. The lesson that travels best is not romantic. Coalition before chorus, logistics before legend, intelligence before inevitability, meaning before memory. Menelik II and Empress Taytu Betul proved that clarity is a kind of power, that technology without humility misreads terrain, and that the patient governance of water, grain, maps, and morale can turn a treaty's trap into a hinge on which history swings. Quiz: which lesson from Adwa matters most today? A. Logistics and terrain mastery win before contact. B. Coalition and meaning unify motives. Then move comment A or B below. What's your take? Where do you see Adwa's playbook applying right now? Leadership, entrepreneurship, community organizing, or personal decision-making? Drop your perspective so others can learn from it. And if you value work like this, please subscribe to support the channel so we can make the next one.